Evidence of ice age points to a recent catastrophic worldwide flood. Onset of the ice age. The lowering of the temperature of the polar latitudes as the vapor ice canopy precipitated would have had immediate and important climatologic reactions. However, the initially warm temperature of the water in the polar seas, together with its continuing turbulent state, sufficed to prevent its freezing for a period of unknown but substantial duration. Undoubtedly, the first water actually to freeze would have been that mixed in with the sediments being deposited in these regions, cut off, as it were, from the warmer temperatures and the turbulent agitation of the free water in the open seas. Thus must have been formed, at some intermediate or late stage in the Deluge period, worldwide flood, those vast stretches of permanently frozen soils in the Arctic and subarctic known as permafrost. Embedded in these frozen mucks of the Arctic are a large number of fossil mammals, apparently trapped and in some cases partially frozen before the soft parts had decayed. The extensive silty alluvium, now frozen in central Alaska, contains numerous mammal fauna. Freezing has preserved the skin and tissue of some of the mammals. The faunal list includes 2 bears, dire wolf, fox, badger, wolverine, saber-toothed cat, jaguar, lynx, woolly mammoth, mastodon, 2 horses, camel, saiga antelope, 4 bisons, caribou, moose, stag moose, elk, 2 sheep, musk ox, and yak types, ground sloth, and several rodents. The number of individuals is so great that the assemblage as a whole must represent a rather long time. Are of flint. That these mammals and the freezing of the alluvium now containing them represents a rather sharp change of climate is quite obvious. The time of inception of permafrost remains, nevertheless, unknown. The fossil record, according to this evolutionist, supposedly implies that in earlier Cenozoic time there could have been no permafrost in the Arctic region. The areas of former ice sheet bears no evident relation to the distribution of permafrost. J.K. Charlesworth says, vast herds of mammoth and other animals, the New Siberian islands in the far north of Asia, have yielded mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, musk ox, saiga antelope, reindeer, tiger, Arctic fox, glutton, bear, and horse among the 66 animal species. Required forests, meadows, and steppes for their sustenance. They could not have lived in a climate like the present, with its icy winds, snowy winters, frozen ground, and tundra moss the year around. Larry Vardaman states, if all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered by the flood, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, as described in Genesis 7:19 and 21, then it is likely that massive global upheavals of the crust and oceans were involved. If the geologic column is a record of catastrophic events of the flood over a period of about a year, some 5,000 years ago, then large quantities of heat would have been released from frictional forces of erosion and from crustal motions such as continental breakup, plate subduction, and earthquakes. Because the oceans would have been in direct contact with many of the sources of heat, the water would have been warmed and remained so for some time following the flood. Record of heat in the sediments. Layers of sediment averaging over 1,000 feet thick cover the seafloor all over the earth. Samples of these sediments have been extracted by deep sea drilling techniques, which have led to a better understanding of Earth history. Seafloor sediments not only contain sand and mud eroded from the continents, but also shells of microorganisms which lived and died in the ocean. Some of these microorganisms, called foraminifera incorporate varying quantities of oxygen isotopes in their shells as the temperature changes, allowing them to be used as a paleothermometer, an instrument for estimating temperature in the past. Kinnett et al. In his group 2 have analyzed the concentration of oxygen isotopes in foraminifera, which live on the seafloor near the Antarctic, using a conventional time scale which assumes that the seafloor sediments have accumulated over millions of years at a rate similar to that observed today. They found a slow decrease in temperature of about 20 degrees Celsius since the end of the Cretaceous period, when the dinosaurs lived, was so warm. This is just presuming that this is true, not that it is. However, if these same data are interpreted from a young Earth catastrophic flood perspective, an entirely different result is found. Using a biblical timescale which assumes that the seafloor sediments have accumulated mostly over a few thousand years during and following the Genesis flood, initially at a very high rate and decreasing exponentially to that observed today. Vardaman found a rapid decrease in temperature immediately after the flood, followed by a slower decrease with time, most of this cooling to have only taken about 2,000 years to reach temperatures commonly observed today. Sounds more sensible. The shape of the cooling curve is similar to that expected by a body starting at a high temperature and cooling by heat transfer to a cooler reservoir. The rate of cooling is rapid initially, but slows with time, approaching the final temperature asymptomatically. There's a matically in there, i.e. in a relatively straight line. During the steep portion of the cooling curve, the climate of the Earth would be expected to change dramatically as the oceans cool by some 20 degrees centigrade. Today, when the ocean surface averages only 1 or 2 degrees warmer during an El Nino event, major changes occur in circulation and precipitation pattern over the Pacific Ocean, leading to major storms and flooding on the west coasts of North and South America. How much more dramatic would climate changes be for a 20 degree centigrade cooling? Implications of a cooling ocean. If the model of seafloor sediment accumulation described above is correct, the implications are dramatic. Most of the sediments found on the seafloor were deposited rapidly just a few thousand years ago. The rate of accumulation would have been very rapid during and immediately following the flood. Not only erosion of sands and muds from the continents would have been involved, but also the accumulation of microscopic plant and animal organisms from the ocean itself. This would indicate that the tiny organisms in the ocean probably bloomed following the flood due to all the nutrients added by the flood and the greater warmth, as well as fewer large predators, allowing a continued rapid doubling of biomass. The warm ocean would have produced at least 4 significant atmospheric effects. Much greater evaporation of water vapor from the ocean to the atmosphere would have led to a greater storminess and precipitation, particularly in the polar regions. Large temperature contrasts between the oceans and continents would have produced strong winds and heavy precipitation parallel to coastlines. The blooming of ocean life following the flood would likely have absorbed large quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, causing radiational cooling. Warm oceans and radiational cooling aloft would create more convection in the atmosphere, leading to more precipitation. The atmospheric effects appear to be an adequate explanation for the Ice Age, which produced more extensive glaciers than today and massive sheets of ice over large areas of the polar regions and mid-latitudes. The Ice Age in the biblical time frame probably lasted from shortly after the flood to about the time of Abraham. The Ice Age probably affected the peoples of the Bible with a cooler, wetter climate and more grasslands in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Palestine, and North Africa. These regions are known for their desert climate today, but evidence points to more vegetation in the past. Once the oceans cooled to the equilibrium temperatures of today, the climate reached a stable condition with only relatively minor variations. Generally, the world's climate would be expected to be drier as less moisture was transported into the atmosphere from a cooler ocean. Winds along continental boundaries weakened, less carbon dioxide was removed from the atmosphere, leading to a warming atmospheric temperatures, and convection decreased. Variations in climate would be primarily produced by seasonal changes rather than highly energetic storms and cooling of the ocean. Conclusions and recommendations. Rapid accumulation of seafloor sediments during and following the flood imply that the ocean cooled rapidly over the past few thousand years. This rapid cooling explains the cause of the Ice Age and other climate changes. Rather than being a puzzle for young Earth creationists, thick layers of sediment on the seafloor and massive sheets of ice on the continents appear to be a consequence of the catastrophic events of the Genesis flood. Once again, biblical accounts of Earth history are being confirmed, lending credibility to God's Word. It is recommended that the young Earth model of seafloor sediment accumulation proposed here be improved by analyzing the oxygen and carbon isotopes from many additional cores. The identification of the flood post-flood boundary needs to have a high priority. An analysis of the productivity of sediments containing shells of living organisms in a post-flood ocean should be made and compared with the mass of sediments observed. The accumulation of hundreds of feet of sediment on the average and miles of sediment in some locations such as the Arctic Ocean require very high productivity following the flood. Although the potential for high productivity has been suggested by some, can the ocean supply enough nutrients in some 4,500 years to explain the observed sediments?